Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Dion, and today I want to talk about how we view our clothes and the value that we put on our clothes. Last week I did a de-influencing video and I mentioned how cowgirl boots are pretty trendy, but the pleather ones are gonna hurt your feet. So Ariat was a brand that I think has a good nexus of quality but not like super expensive, and someone commented that they found the Ariat boots pretty expensive. Their boots sort of range from $70 or like $50 or so up to, you know, $500 for super tall boots. And it got me thinking, like, people don't know the value of like real leather and good craftsmanship because there are boots out there, leather boots, that go into the thousands. No hate to that person. I think it's a view that a lot of people have because we are so skewed with how we think prices should be. Our mindset is so skewed because of what fast fashion and just generally corporations have been telling us how much things cost without taking into account cutting costs and unfair wages and everything else. So I want to talk about the value of our clothes and cheap clothing in general and like what that means and the implications of it. So if you like sustainability and fashion content in general, then definitely make sure to subscribe to this channel because I post videos every Thursday. And with that, let's get into it. When we talk about consumption, we need to talk about how much people are making versus how much they're spending and the economy at the time. Right now, in the US at least, everything is super expensive and the government and citizens just blame it on good old-fashioned inflation. Recently, an article from NPR reported on Target reducing prices on over 5,000 items. This, naturally, led many people to ask, so were you just overcharging us for fun or what's going on? And fashion is not immune to that. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, prices for apparel are 784% higher in 2024 versus 1913, a $157 difference in value. Between 1913 and 2024, apparel experienced an average inflation rate of 1.98 per year. In other words, apparel costing $20 in the year 1913 would cost $176 in 2024 for an equivalent purchase. The United States and China are the largest economies and the largest apparel retail markets in the world. The 10 largest economies are measured by nominal GDP, and they are the United States, China, Japan, Germany, the UK, India, France, Italy, Canada, and South Korea. According to Fashion United, during the pandemic, the global apparel and footwear market shrunk between 18 and 20%. After lockdown restrictions were lifted in many parts of the world, consumers headed back to the stores. Once lockdown was over, the apparel and footwear industry grew by 18%. The world now consumes about 80 billion new pieces every year. This is 400% more than the amount we consumed just 2 decades ago. As new clothing comes into our lives, we also discard it at a shocking pace. The average American now generates 82 pounds of textile waste each year. That adds up to more than 11 million tons of textile waste from the US alone. And that is from The True Cost, which is a really excellent documentary. According to Collective Fashion Justice, there are now 52 micro-seasons in the fashion industry. Planned obsolescence is common in fast fashion, meaning clothes are designed to wear out or become unfashionable faster than ever. It is common for brands to burn and destroy clothes that are not sold rather than give them away to, quote, protect their brand. On average, people only wear 50% of the clothes in their wardrobes. Globally, the equivalent of a trash truck full of textiles and clothing is sent to the landfill every second, which is insane. The consumption that we're doing is absolutely insane. I know I'm kind of being educational heavy. We're putting on our glasses today. Get into it. But I didn't want to talk about the cost of items and clothing items and quality versus quantity and all of that without talking about first our consumption habits. This report from the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill Ethics Department claims that the average consumer goes and buys 60% more clothing than they did 17 years ago, while keeping their clothing for half as long as they did before the year 2000. And it's not just the rate of what we're buying clothing, we're buying worse and cheaper clothing. The quality of our clothing is getting worse over time because of things like planned obsolescence and cutting costs. Historian Eve Fisher says, quote, $4 t-shirts, please, we want them 5 for $10. And even then, can we get them on sale? And yet, compared to a world where everything is made by hand, we're talking barely 200 years ago, everything is cheap and plentiful, and we are appallingly ungrateful. When the Industrial Revolution began, it started with factories making cloth. Why? Because clothing used to be frighteningly expensive. 7 hours for sewing, 72 for weaving, 500 for spinning, or a total of 579 hours to make one shirt. At minimum wage, $7.25 an hour, that shirt would cost $4,197.25 for a standard shirt. And obviously that's not even going into account of making the thread, weaving it to be suitable for sewing, raising the sheep. There's so many other things than just making the one shirt. And obviously now that we have technology, we can cut costs in some way, but we still need that human touch to refine things. Not everything can be made 100% machine. And when it does, we often see gaps in quality, and obviously standard sizing is a mess. As we heard from the statistics, even going back 20 years ago, 17 years ago, to our consumption rates would help slow down this insane fast fashion landfill that we are producing. This is an article from the A magazine in reference to consumption rates in the 1970s compared to now. Quote, in the 1970s, the average household would invest about 10% of its income in clothing, including shoes. Each family member would, on average, have about 25 pieces in their collection. 10% of revenue in those days is equivalent to $4,000 in today's economy. Today, the average household spends 3.5% of its income on shoes and clothes, about $1,700 a year. However, the number of garments has increased to about 70 pieces for each person in the household. By the 1970s, synthetics such as polyester were increasingly widespread. Then, in the 21st century, there has been an explosion in the amount of spandex. It is very difficult now to find clothing that isn't made of a blend rather than pure cotton, linen, wool, or silk. Synthetic materials don't last as long as natural materials. There's increased pilling and degradation as they are washed. I think often when we talk about consumption rates and lowering our consumption and the fashion environmental crisis, we think we have to reinvent the wheel to try to solve this mystery problem when it's literally going back 20, 30, 40 years ago. A report from the Fashion Edits also support the claim that the 1970s had a pivotal shift in fashion in general. Quote, in the 1970s, most of the garments that households would purchase were made in the United States, about 95%. Along with homegrown clothing production, almost all high schools in the country offered home economics and sewing classes for students. The art of designing and executing clothing pieces was easier to produce. Only 2% of the clothing we sport is made in America today. The 1970s was a stepping stone decade in that manufacturing, and textile factories were springing up in Asia and other low labor cost countries. Now that we've talked about the economy and the quality of our clothes, I want to talk about who makes our clothes, because I feel like it is so hard to look past all the grievances of fast fashion when you're educated on the treatment of the people who make your clothes. And this is from The True Cost, again, a really good documentary. I believe it's free on YouTube. Quote, we are increasingly disconnected from the people who make our clothing, as 97% of items are now made overseas. There are roughly 40 million garment workers in the world today, many of whom do not share the same rights or protections that many people in the West do. They are some of the lowest paid workers in the world. And roughly 85% of all garment workers are women. A statistic from Collective Fashion Justice states that 9 out of 10 garment workers in Bangladesh cannot afford enough food for themselves. A statistic from Remake says 50% of Bangladeshi female garment workers claim they experienced verbal abuse, and 86 claimed to be physically exhausted. The study from University of Chapel Hill claimed that 80% of the millions of garment workers are women between the ages of 18 and 24. Less than 2% of these workers earn a living wage, and women and children are frequently paid less than their male counterparts. From the Medium, they said that it is estimated that 2% of garment workers earn a living wage while being forced to work 14 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Many fast fashion retailers dodge responsibility regarding wages. In Bangladesh, over 60% of female garment workers reported having felt intimidated or threatened with violence at work. 68% of Cambodia's female garment workers have reported feeling unsafe or uncomfortable at work. And in Vietnam, 34% of garment workers reported experiencing sexual violence. And for me, this is such a touching issue because I call myself a feminist and hopefully an intersectional feminist, at least that's what I try to be. And fashion is such a traditionally women-centric, women-driven industry. So this idea that we're not standing with other women across countries it like is so heartbreaking because for us to look good and trendy, we are like practically enslaving other women overseas. Fast fashion is more than just like a economic and environmental issue. It is definitely a feminist and human rights issue. But let's talk about the environmental impact. The following statistics are gonna be from earth.org. I'm gonna have a link to a Google Doc with all of my sources. There's just too many sources to all link down below in the description. So the Google Doc will be public. That way you can just go and all the sources will be there. And they'll stay there, so if you ever want to reference back, you can look at that. Of the 100 billion garments produced each year, 92 million tons end up in landfills. If the trend continues, the number of fast fashion waste is expected to soar up to 130 million tons a year by the end of the decade. The average US consumer throws away 81.5 pounds of clothes in America alone. An estimated 11 million tons of textile waste, the equivalent to 85% of all textiles, ends up in landfills on a yearly basis. That's the equivalent to approximately 81.5 pounds per person per year and around 2,150 pieces per second countrywide. The number of times a garment is worn has declined around 36% in 15 years. $500 billion is lost every year because of underwearing and failure to recycle clothes. 2.6 million tons of returned clothes ended up in landfills in 2020 alone. It is estimated that 16 million tons of CO2 emissions were created by online returns in the US in 2020, the equivalent of 3.5 million cars on the road for a year. One study estimating that there was 15% of fabric used in garment manufacturing is wasted. And I know that was a lot of stats again, but I mean, the literally billions and millions of tons that we are throwing out of usable, of clothing. We're just being so wasteful and so negligent with our clothing choices. And with the environmental impact and the female woman garment worker impact, we also have environmental racism. Typically, environmental climate crises tend to happen in the poorest, most vulnerable areas of the world. From Collective Fashion Justice, quote, Kuntamanto markets in Accra, Ghana sees an estimated 15 million garments flow through each week. These clothes are mostly from fast fashion brands thrown out or, quote, donated to op shops by people largely in the West. Here, many of the clothes are skillfully refurbished by local people and businesses. 40% of the clothing leaves the market as waste. Accra lacks the landfill space for clothing waste, so much of it is burned in the open air, swept into the gutter, where it eventually makes its way to the sea, or dumped in informal settlements where Accra's most vulnerable citizens live. From an article in CNN, they reported that Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, announced a plan to ban used clothing imports to the East African country in a speech saying that the trade stifles the development of local textile industry. Every year, millions of hand-me-down t-shirts, jeans, and dresses make their way from the donation bins in the US and Europe to East Africa. Exports of used textiles from the European Union tripled between 2000 and 2019 to hit 1.7 million tons a year. Nearly half ended up in Africa. If you want to know more about environmental racism in the Global South, specifically Africa, I cannot recommend A Bigger Picture by Vanessa Nakate enough. She is a young climate activist from Uganda, and really, it's a short read and it was so interesting. I know a lot of this I mentioned also in my Brandy Melville video about the fast fashion industry and everything. So this might be a lot of repeats. If you haven't seen that video, it talks a lot about the same thing, about the human cost and the environmental cost of fast fashion. So definitely check that out as well. Now that we've talked a lot about like the stats, I just want to give like my personal little soapbox thoughts on the matter. Honestly, I think if you can be arrested in the streets for being naked, then obviously clothing is a human right. You can't participate as a human in society without being covered up. No shirt, no shoes, no service, right? So I understand that clothing is a human right, and protection from the elements, from extreme cold, from extreme heat, is also a human right. And we do have enough clothes made on this planet to ensure people are protected from those elements. However, the average American throws out 81 tons of fashion waste a year, and that's not a human right. That is a human rights violation. This idea of like, we all deserve clothes. Okay, you don't deserve the amount of clothes that we are currently consuming. Often when we talk about fast fashion, the first thing people say is, well, poor people deserve clothes as well. But there's been studies that the average consumer of Shein, Temu, and these other fast fashion places are not the poorest among us. They are typically middle to upper middle class people. Often when it comes to the environment, we'll use poor people as our little human shield to shield us from criticism about our own choices. Poor people are not doing $500 Shein hauls with over 200 pieces in it. Poor people don't have 50 swimsuits from H&M. And to me, it's very unfair to use poor people as an excuse, because if you actually did care about poor people, you would care about the poor people in Ghana and Uganda who are basically being used as a trash can for our cheap clothing. If you cared about poor people, you would care about the garment workers that aren't being paid enough. So, sounds like you don't really care about poor people, or maybe you only care about poor people in the West. But even so, the landfills in the United States are in the poorest counties in the United States. So if you cared about poor people, then again, fast fashion, hyperconsumption, and cheap fast fashion that goes straight to landfill affects the poorest among us as well. I am definitely empathetic because I know obviously vintage clothing, secondhand clothing, a lot of it does not come in plus sizes, and sustainable clothing brands and just a lot of clothing brands in general don't come in extended sizing. And often fast fashion brands are the only brands that will offer up to like 3 or 5X. Again, clothing is definitely a human right. I also think people have the right, including plus size people, have the right to quality clothing. They shouldn't just be forced to buy crappy clothing from Shein or Temu. Brands should step it up and extend their sizing, because it's not fair just for them to only have one option. Handmade and quality clothing is expensive. That's why people used to not own a lot of it. Telling skilled artisans that their handmade crochet coat is too expensive or their hand-thrown pottery vase made from wild clay is overpriced is insulting to the years of education and practice for this person to create this piece of art. I see this all the time on like TikTok, where it's like, I like this, but it's way too expensive. I like this, it's way too expensive. I think the issue is that we actually just don't know how much things cost. We don't know how much time and effort goes into things, because paying people a living wage to hand crochet something or hand throw pottery something, yeah, it's gonna be a high cost, and artists and artisans deserve that. If you think it's such an easy and basic item to make that you don't understand why this artist is selling it for that high of a price, you are more than welcome to pick up a new hobby. I can assure you, you'll be humbled. Crocheting is difficult. Pottery is difficult. You know, croissants are like $4 sometimes, like a good croissant, maybe a pain au chocolat, an almond croissant. They can be like $3.50 to $4. The first time I made croissants, they take like 2 days to make. I was like, if I counted like my labor hours, this would be like $12 a croissant because it takes so long, and the ingredients and everything. Learning how to hand make things really does give you an appreciation for how much time and labor goes into, and skill and talent goes into making something. We often hear that we're entitled to a cheap handmade item, but the maker is not entitled to fair compensation. We're entitled to buying trending clothing, but the workers are not entitled to safe working conditions. We're entitled to cheap and affordable clothing. Workers are not entitled to a fair wage. We're entitled to throw out whatever we don't want anymore. The global south, and eventually all of us, because climate crises will not only affect people in the global south, are not entitled to a clean environment. Entitlement to the consumer for the West and the global north, violating human rights for the people in the global south. And that's, I feel like, what it comes down to, is that we're like, well, we deserve these clothes. Well, okay, do they not deserve fair compensation, safe working conditions, free of harassment, a clean environment, clean air, clean river, clean streams? Why is your deserving of a cheap going out top way more than people's basic human rights? And I know a lot of people aren't really gonna care, and they're gonna continue to do it. If you watch that SNL skit, you know what I'm talking about.
Hey, this is giving shady. Be real, is this shady?
If it was, would you stop buying it?
No.
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 Maybe. No.
But for the people who do care, here are some of my tips for finding quality clothing. I'm definitely not an expert. I'm just kind of picky, and I judge what I think feels like quality. But Jennifer Wang at Wang Jennifer with 2 N's, 2 R's on TikTok will like review clothes and show you how to find quality clothing in less expensive stores and just the value of clothing and is very, very helpful. Crystal Uncut also does a great job at giving tips about finding quality clothing. And Tanner Leatherstein is one of my favorites. He will buy designer bags and destroy them, and based on his leather expertise and what he knows about leather, tell you how much the price based on the construction and the quality of leather and the hardware and everything it actually would cost versus what the brand is charging. And it's fascinating because obviously just because it's a high price tag doesn't mean it's quality clothing, but quality clothing tends to have a high price tag. So some of the things that I look for in quality clothing are seams. So we want finished hems, straight seams, double stitched. I also look at hardware, metal versus plastic zippers, hidden zippers, the visibility of zippers. Zippers are one of the hardest things to learn how to do in sewing. And so is it strongly attached? Is the invisible zipper laying flat? Is it the flaps like itching in the back, or can you see those flaps within the dress from the outside? You wanna look at buttons. Are they plastic or plain with like loose stitching that kind of comes up off the ends, or are they super tightly and strongly attached, made of tortoiseshell, leather covered, wooden, pearl, or ornate buttons? Those are always also gonna be a good sign. Also, learning how to sew a button is so easy, such a good skill to learn, very, very helpful. I also look at collars and cuffs, something very stiff that's clearly lined and ironed properly versus something that's very, very floppy, and the straightness of the stitching. I find often you can see it most evident in cuffs and collars. You wanna look at things lined versus double lined versus unlined. Often cheap clothing will be very see-through and not have a lining underneath it, and quality clothing will have a synthetic lining or even like a cotton lining, like a slip, that will help maintain the shape of the garment. You also wanna look at the thickness and opacity of the fabric. Is it see-through? Is it flimsy? Does it look, can you see every single lump and bump when you wear it? And the type of the material. I'm a natural material girl. Even though natural materials have their own environmental impact, mine's mostly for my texture issues. But even with synthetic fabrics, you wanna look at the length of the fibers. The shorter the fiber length, which means like the thread length, in the garment, the easier it's gonna fall apart and pull and have holes and everything. It has a long fiber, it's gonna be a little bit stronger. You can get something that's synthetic or polyester that is still high quality made. Lots of couture designers use polyester nowadays, but regardless, not all polyester and synthetic materials are made the same. So you do wanna look for something that's a little bit more high quality. And with that, okay, thank you guys for watching this long and informative video. I hope you learned something. And again, my channel is all about just lowering consumption. You can love fashion, you can express yourself through fashion without having to buy something every month or every 2 months even. You can use what you have and upcycle and be creative and appreciate fashion in that way. If you guys did enjoy this, definitely give it a thumbs up because I worked really hard on it. Again, I will leave the link to all of my sources down below if you want to check out some of the articles and graphs that I used. Definitely make sure to subscribe to this channel because I post videos every Thursday. And if you like my videos, check out my Patreon. I post 2 new videos every single month. And follow me on TikTok and Instagram for even more content. And with that, have a happy, happy day. Bye.